Hey everyone, Phoebe Rizzo here, and going back to talk to the void, way back old school, with Rodan, or Sora no Daikaiju Radon. Now, definitely kicking a little old school today, but as far as old kaiju movies go, Rodan's kind of a favorite of mine. It's one I've seen repeatedly over the years, even when I was little knee-high Phoebe Rizzo way back when. Now, there's several versions of this movie available in the States, notably a dub and a sub version, which are actually slightly different films in tone, but both are actually fairly watchable. And as far as dubbed kaiju movies go, Rodan changes the least amongst a lot of other films. They don't splice in nearly as much, and some of the narration they add actually does help the film around a little bit, because in that era, many Japanese films let a lot more silences breathe a little bit, which works. But for tones that American audiences are used to, it seems a little empty at points. It leaves you more open to interpretation, which is also still very good. Now, for today's review, I'm actually focusing on the subtitled version, which in the States is a little harder to come by. Not impossible to find, but harder to find in physical media at least. Now, the run times are a little bit different. The subtitled version runs, I believe, almost 20 minutes longer, but for cut content wise, it's mostly a few reactions, and I didn't get the exact rundown, but essentially the core aspect of the movie does remain the same. But however, this edition alone for DVD is actually now out of print and quite rare. So this one I saw, just double checked it today on eBay, goes for over $100 itself for two movies. So good luck finding this one. But Rodan itself, as in the dubbed version, is wildly available for not too expensive. It's been picked up and re-released repeatedly. But the subtitled one, I've seen a few releases, but I don't know how legitimate they are. So buyer beware if we're looking for a cheaper subtitled version. Now, the plot of Rodan, well, I guess I should mention the titular character's name difference between the two titles. If you notice when I said the Japanese title, it was Radon. Now, essentially, they did change it when they moved the film to America, and they do that a lot with most kaiju. I mean, a lot of their name changes make a bit of sense. I mean, Gojira to Godzilla is maybe one of the. Then it just becomes so common now, but at the time it was pretty distinct. Mosura to Mothra, again, easy, but most of them were fairly the same. Now, Rodan, they changed from Radon to Rodan, actually for a very particular reason, and this is the only one I know that actually had a legitimate reason for the name change other than to make it more pronounceable for an English audience. And that, oddly, is because of a brand of soap. There was a Radon type of soap widely available at the time, which was the 1950s, 1956 to be exact. So to avoid copyright and confusion, they just switched the O and the A from Radon to Rodan. Personally, I actually grew up with the name Rodan, so that's the one I'm most familiar with, and it kind of sticks with me the most. But the Toho itself has embraced both versions of the name, so okay, so the plot of this one, it starts around with a mining crew who have been digging particularly deep into Mount Aso. Well, it's more of a mine near the volcanic Mount Aso. It's a little ways away, but and recently they hit something that kind of flooded out the mine, but we're still trying to work with it. Then people start going missing. And after some confusion over whether or not one of their miners might be a murderer, turns out that they've got large insects running around their mine. While trying to exterminate them, the ground shakes, and next thing you know, planes are going missing out of the sky, livestock is vanishing, and unidentified flying objects are sighted, which turn out to be Radon. Rodan. Now, I should state that they actually explain the name Radon in the subtitled version. It's pretty much a play on Pteranodon. So the name actually does make a degree of sense. I mean, Rodan doesn't really mean anything, but Radon does actually have a correlation to the animal it's indicating. Now, the dubbed version immediately begins tying Rodan to the atomic bombs, but this one only more it goes well into the middle of the movie before they bring it up, and then only as a theory. Back in the 50s, during the atomic scare, there was a lot of giant bug movies and giant kaiju movies that were focused around radiation causing it. Now, essentially, they state that Radon was likely woken up by the atomic bomb, or his eggs was suddenly able to hatch because of it. But they do note that most pteranodons were much smaller than Rodan is. Ugh, saying both names have got me going interchangeable on them now. Anyway, so in this, then, and not only then do they have the one giant flying monster? There are two. So, two large pterodactyls, pteranodons, flying around, wreaking havoc, flying at supersonic speed. And it pretty much goes from there, the government trying to do what they can to solve that problem. Now, tonally, the movie does hit a few sweet notes, particularly towards the end of the film with how they portray essentially the mated pair. The dub version does do a little bit of kind of explicitly stating that it's a mated pair and that one is more how protective they are to each other. So both versions are really worth seeing to just kind of get a whole picture of it, because a lot more in the Japanese version is subtle and more implied than explicitly stated. Let's see. Radon itself, very big pteranodon that can fly at supersonic speed, creating shock waves. And in this film, and this film alone, he seems to be able to breathe out a wind blast, but later that seemed to have been more retconned into him just flapping his wings to create windstorms, which he was doing at the same time, but this one it did specifically show him breathing wind, which I believe was actually cut from the American version. I think that's just seen in the Japanese, but that seems to have fallen away from Rodan's abilities since then. The human story mostly evolves around the miners, particularly one man who gets trapped in the cave-in and then ends up getting amnesia after seeing one of the Rodan hatch, as well as his fiancée trying to snap him out of it, and he's one of the main people leading the charge to try to find where the Rodans are nesting so they can be dealt with. It's a pretty simple film in terms of how they resolve the giant monster thing, but it's one of the most effective, and it's largely regarded as one of the better kaiju movies out there, right up there with the original Mothra and the original Godzilla. This was actually Toho's first color kaiju movie, and I think it actually may be the first one out of Japan that was the first kaiju movie out of Japan that was in color. I will say personally, when I was a kid, this movie actually kind of freaked me out a little bit from the monsters that were in the mine. It kind of stuck with me. These large bug monsters. They're described as large dragonfly nymphs that were creeping around through flooded caverns and pulling people under and attacking them. So the knee-high Phoebe Rizzo was a little freaked out by those scenes. So nowadays the effects definitely do not really hold up completely well. I mean, especially in the when you see Radon flying himself, you could obviously see the wires holding him up. Now, I have read that a Blu-ray version, I don't know if it's available in the States, exists where they have actually digitally removed some of the wiring and more obvious things like that to help add to that a little bit, but I don't know how widely available that is. The costumes for the Mega Neurons, which are the dragonfly nymphs, are nowadays they're pretty cheesy, but when I was a kid, they kind of actually got to me, I will admit. Um, Otherwise, the general message and tone of the film still holds up, and it's definitely worth a watch for any fan of giant monster movies. My only complaint, at least in this version, I don't recall it being as bad for when watching it before, but the mine scenes can be very dark, and it's hard to make out what's going on occasionally, but it's not too bad. It's mostly just whenever they're down in the mine, which is really only when it's in the flooded sections also, so it's not the entirety of it. It's just one of those, a few poorly lit sections that I was having a problem with. But otherwise, this one is a personal favorite. It's dated enough that I can't quite give it a 5, but I'll still give it a solid 4 MacGuffins. And it's a classic. Like I said, I've been watching this movie since I was a kid, and I still come back to it every once in a while. If you haven't seen it, I definitely recommend giving it a watch. Usually for kaiju movies, I always recommend going subtitled if you can, but this one, the dub does hold up pretty well, all things considered. It isn't a perfect, but it isn't a bad watch. So whichever version you find, give it a chance. And I'll probably see you back in a day or so again as I continue my January favorite off birthday bash. I don't really have a name for this. Have a good night, everybody.